You're listening to Policy, Guns and Money, the ASPI podcast. Hi there, I'm Renee Jones and you're listening to the first episode of ASPI's podcast, Policy, Guns and Money. Coming up later on the show, is free speech under attack? Maddie and Jackie investigate free speech panic. But first we'll hear from our two grumpy strategists. Michael and Marcus from our Defence and Strategy program unpack the latest AUSMIN meeting.
So Marcus, it's a great time to be having this chat because we had the Australia-US ministerial meeting, AUSMIN, between the counterpart US Defence and Foreign Ministers. So that's Secretary of State Pompeo, Secretary of Defence Mattis, Defence Minister Payne and Foreign Minister Bishop meeting in San Francisco. Now that's on the back of the G7 meetings and the NATO meeting and the Helsinki summit between Putin and Trump. So I think it's a fascinating time to talk. But at the same time, it's a kind of depressing time to talk.
Well, I guess you could say that the AUSMIN was not as big a train wreck as some of the Trump meetings in Europe, but you still seem to be a little disappointed with what came out of AUSMIN.
Yeah, well, look, I'm a real aficionado of the Australia-US alliance, and I've worked on it for a long time, and I've seen the direct benefits to Australian security out of it, so I am a fan. But when I looked at the outcomes, and I looked at that 19 job list that our four leaders of our two nations' defence and foreign policy establishments put out, I must admit I was a little bored, and I think that's a really bad test. And if I was bored, then people that are not aficionados certainly would have been. So, my line on this is, if the alliance was a car, it had a routine service. It's 100,000 kilometres service. But what I was really hoping for out of AUSMIN was more, if the alliance was a car, then it was a case of pimp my ride. We're going to see something exciting and different that really set a future agenda, and we didn't see that.
Mm-hmm. Now, but just recently you described the US alliance structure with its partners in the Asia Pacific as a donut, meaning it was pretty empty in the middle and the US had gone missing. So which is it? Has the US gone missing, or should we be doubling down on the relationship?
Well, there's two elements there. So the US has historically run an alliance system, a global alliance system, with it as the hub and a bunch of alliance partners, including Australia, as spokes, so a hub and spoke model. But under the Trump America First model, America's acting in a unilateral way. So it's not orchestrating its alliance partners. And so there's a missing American leadership of the alliance relationships. So that's the donut. There's no hub now. It's all rim or donut. Now, what does that mean for Australia? Well, I think Peter Jennings, the executive director of ASPI, had some of the most interesting things to say when he's talked about, is it time for a plan B? And what he said there deals directly with this. It says, so if American leadership around security in our region is not going to be as strong, what does Australia need to do? Well, step one, we need to maintain access to US high technology and share intelligence. Those things are fundamental force multipliers for Australia.
So in a sense, you seem to be saying plan A and plan B are not completely contradictory. That if we were to pursue some lines of thought on plan B, we still wouldn't completely walk away from plan A.
Well, not unless we want to have a much larger population, which we don't have, and spend a lot more of our national wealth on defence, which for many years the taxpayer has not supported. So we need to spend a lot more on GDP. Now, you've done some work. If Australia were to move from spending 2% of GDP on defence, which is the current government's target, to let's say 3%, how much more money would that require from the taxpayer and deliver to invest in defence?
Well, if we grew at a steady rate over the next 10 years from 2% to 3%, that would result in defence getting an extra $122 billion. Now, that's a lot of money. That's, Joint Strike Fighter is probably around 15 billion, so it's about 8 times more money than the Joint Strike Fighter project is costing us, to give an example. So it would make a real capability difference. But one of the things I noticed about Peter's list of things to explore as Plan B, it's not just about things to buy, but it's also about things to do, such as being more active in the Pacific or working more closely with countries like Indonesia. And I was just wondering, are there any lines of activity that you think are most promising in exploring Plan B?
Well, I think so. I think moving away from these big, complex, integrated manned platforms, like ships, aircraft, submarines. The term of art is these are high-value, low-volume assets, which means they're very expensive, they're very useful, but you've only got them in tiny numbers. Now, technological surprise is part of the history of warfare. If you've got very expensive things in small numbers that you can't afford to lose, but the risk of technological surprise is increasing, as it is with the rise of China as a technological power, then maybe that's a bad idea. So part of Peter's Plan B was supercharging access to new technologies and the cheap consumable kind of system instead of these big, complex, integrated manned platforms. He suggested forming an Australian DARPA, which is the US Advanced Research Agency, which has had a track record of getting hold of new technologies and getting them into the hands of the military fast.
Yeah, as ASPI's previously noted, Defence only spends about 0.5% of its budget on its technological innovation programs. And even that small amount of money seems to be producing results already. So it seems like increasing that could result in some quick wins pretty quickly without distorting the overall budget. So I would agree, that's definitely something to explore.
Although I'm reminded of something that a former head of the Defence Materiel Organisation, Mick Roach, used to always say. Had the Secretary of the Department would say to him, "Hey Mick, I need you to spend $5 million more on this. You've got a big budget, so make it available." And Mick would always say, "I've got a big budget, Secretary, but my big budget is made up of a lot of smaller budgets. So those numbers are all committed. What would you like me to stop?" So from your defence economic hat, what would you trim or stop to double the size of innovation in defence?
Well, that's always the question, isn't it? That if you can only spend every dollar once, defence is really, really bad at getting rid of old capabilities. You look back in history and you think, what have we divested in the recent past? And you could think of the aircraft carrier back in the 80s. And since then, we haven't really gotten rid of anything. So it is a pretty a weak point, I think, in our strategic planning.
So let me press you. Where would you make room?
Well, I've laid my cards on the table before that I think, submarines are going to cost us an awful lot of money and they're going to take a long time to arrive. We need to do something sooner. So while I wouldn't cancel the submarine project, that would be fairly dramatic. I think taking some of that money, some of the shipbuilding money, and investing in innovative technologies, I think is probably going to result in a quicker capability dividend.
I think you're right. I think if you think about $35 billion for 9 frigates and what we now hear is $200 billion for 12 future submarines, which includes an estimate of their operating cost, I think doubling the size of the innovation budget would be doable without that even being noticed in those big programs. So that's an obvious thing to do. Peter in his Plan B also talked about Australia lifting its game in the South Pacific, saying,
Yep.
Either Australia lifts its game or it loses the South Pacific.
Yeah, and I think, the recent announcement of a US, Japanese, Australian investment bank is potentially a good first step there, though there's not been a lot of details around how that's going to work. But what I would say is that any Australian investment in the South Pacific, it needs to really distinguish itself, sort of brand itself differently from the Chinese model of very big, top-down, big investment infrastructure projects such as stadiums and big roads and big ports, as we've seen in Vanuatu. And I think it needs to be much more grass level, working directly with the people of the South Pacific. So whether it's microfinancing or helping local communities, I think whichever approach we take, it needs to work at that kind of level to show how our approach is fundamentally different from the Chinese one.
I think you're right, but I think there's some defence work there too. Like Peter pointed out, a more direct Navy presence. It's great to give them more capable patrol boats of their own that Australia pays for and helps operate, but a standing presence of the Royal Australian Navy just makes a lot of sense. Maybe we can use some of those fantastic new wharves that the Chinese are building.
Well, that would be kind of an irony if an Australian offshore patrol vessel, was based out of a Chinese port in Vanuatu. But I do think the new OPVs that we're getting are the perfect capability to deploy into the South Pacific and work with the South Pacific nations, improving their capability and waving an Australian flag there to show that we are a long-term partner.
Yeah, so I think this is the start of sketching out ideas about pimping our ride, but I really think it's a time for a future agenda and an ambitious agenda, both for Australia but for the alliance partnership. Thanks for the talk, Marcus.
Thank you, Michael.
Moving on to two less grumpy strategists now, we have Maddie and Jackie looking at whether free speech is under attack.
Welcome to the first iteration of the podcast, Jackie. How you feeling?
I'm very excited. How are you?
Yeah, no, it's just exciting stuff. So let's get right into it. What are some awesome, interesting long reads you've come across this week, Jackie?
Well, seeing I'm the expert of long reads at ASPI, I actually came across one. Last Thursday, The Guardian, in its long read section,
Love it.
published a very interesting article titled The Free Speech Panic by William Davies. And it's a really interesting piece going into a debate that we've been witnessing for a couple of years now of increasingly having opposing opinions, from time to time also quite radical opposing opinions. But yeah, he goes into it and how we can deal with that. What he makes his most important point about is that he criticizes the right and the conservative side of things that they claim, these days is basically the end of free speech. They criticize always that everything they say is being censored. They can't express themselves freely. It is a whole piece summarized really well in one sentence.
The claim that free speech is under attack is often a mask for other political frustrations and fears.
So he pinpoints that there's this claim, but actually maybe there's a lot more coming with it.
Yeah, there's a lot more going on underneath the surface. That's interesting. And it actually reminds me of this awesome podcast I was listening to the other day, the Ezra Klein Show. Don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's great. And Ezra Klein sat down with Arthur Brooks, who's the president of the American Enterprise Institute.
Interesting.
Interestingly, yeah, it's quite a conservative think tank operating out of the US. And they just had the title of this episode was called "How to Disagree Better," which is
very important.
Links in well with your piece. And they just had this fascinating discussion on how people of opposing ideologies can disagree better. And Brooks has done some really awesome research in this area, and he's launching his own podcast that's all about the art and practice of disagreeing.
Timely?
Yeah,
timely.
Very timely. And it just sort of, what it's really getting at is, and it's the same as what I think this Guardian piece that you mentioned is getting at. And, the idea being that society's issue with discourse and our issue with free speech isn't that we are, it's not that we're disagreeing too much. It's just that we've forgotten how to disagree well, So it's about like, how can we encourage arguments that are actually productive, and one line from that Guardian piece that really kind of, stood out to me that, in re-listening to this podcast was when, Davies claims that there's this narrative being put forward by conservative movements in the UK and the US.
An entire generation of millennials is leaving university and entering the workforce without the resilience to cope with disagreement.
And that's quite a stark claim to make,
It is. So basically the whole issue we're facing is creating conditions that resolve disagreement and differences between us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of that question of who do we sort of brings in this question of who do we give a platform to? Kind
Yeah,
of thing.
exactly.
And
the whole no platforming debate.
yeah, which perhaps I don't know if you've seen in the news, but I was home in Brisbane over the weekend, and the organisers of the Brisbane Writers Festival have come under quite a bit of fire. Actually.
Oh, how come?
Well, they've been accused of attacking free speech because they disinvited Jermaine Greer and Bob Carr to the festival, and the organisers have come out and said that, this has happened because they were, quote, trying to find a balance within the program. But, it's not the first time something like this has happened, and it really calls into question those ideas that we've just been chatting about with the podcast and that Guardian piece on, how do we teach people to disagree in a productive manner and maintain
and civilized manner.
Yeah,
especially.
absolutely.
This reminds me, a friend back home in Germany, she's a political consultant but also a blogger. And for the past 2 years, she's been fighting with a young guy who's a member of the AfD, so the Alternative for Germany, this right-wing extremist party, you can say, actually, which is also in parliament now in Germany. And yeah, so they had all these debates online going on, even spoke on the phone every now and then, disagreed on everything. She's a passionate social democrat, has a migratory background, obviously a woman, she ticks a lot of boxes of what hardcore AfD people oppose. Anyway, he was coming up to Berlin with a group of young men who are all members of the youth organization of the AfD and proposed to her to meet up for a couple of drinks and actually talk to each other. And at first she was a bit skeptical, but then she agreed to do it and she published about it. And she got a lot of backlash, which I find is not very helpful, because she actually agreed to sit down with people where she knew what was coming, she knew there was going to be a lot of disagreement, potentially fighting, yelling. And yeah, it was all there, but it still remained in a civilized manner. They went 2 nights in a row for some drinks and spoke about all sorts of different stuff, from political opinions, social issues, and so on. And she said, not only did they disagree, but also among themselves, they disagreed so much. But yeah, summarizing all of that, she said, look, I did what everyone says. I seek more dialogue to disagree better.
Exactly.
I think, which was a very brave thing she did, and was really good for her to publish. Yeah.
No, I look forward to reading that. Well, you will have to translate it.
That's okay.
It's in German. So speaking of the continent, the European continent, let's move on to international politics.
Let's do that.
Yeah, so scrolling through my Facebook and Twitter feed, which I do every day.
As we all do.
Yes. There's been a lot coming up, Jackie, on Poland. Can you please explain to me what is happening in Poland?
I sure do. So what's been happening in Poland over the past week is that we've seen, again, demonstrations across the entire country, which has been a pattern over the past 12 months. People going out in the street, voicing their disagreement with what the ruling party has been doing over the past year or so, trying to rebuild the legislative system, changing laws, changing how the courts are being manned. And yeah, so last week, the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, signed into law a bill that basically gives the ruling party the opportunity to pick the people they want to see on the courts. Oh, wow. And so this whole thing is basically undermining the rule of law, and the European Union already started an infringement procedure and so on. So yeah, it's a bit complicated, but it's been a long process. It's very sad to witness this from far away.
I bet, because you spent a bit of time in Poland.
Yes. So, but for everyone who's not really across it, I can recommend a piece that came out in the New Yorker earlier this week, which is titled "Is Poland Retreating from Democracy?" Written by Elizabeth Zarowski. Summarizes it really, really well. So yeah, it's the first piece I would suggest to get a good idea of what's happening.
Okay. Oh, great. I'll have a read of that. And also for listeners, we'll provide links to all this stuff as well. That's a pretty ominous situation, Jackie.
Yeah, so I feel so too. So let's try to end our part in this podcast with a high. So, Maddie, please tell me, have you anything positive recently?
Rare that I do, but this week I did. I'm loving the news that's come out of New Zealand this past week. Their parliament over there has just passed new legislation which grants victims of domestic violence 10 days of paid leave, which is amazing.
It is. Kudos to Wellington indeed. I have to say though, I don't know if I was the only one, but maybe there are more people out there that while scrolling and seeing the news, I found some of the titles, some articles had a bit conflicting because they said New Zealand passes leave for domestic violence victims. And at first I was shocked because it was like, why would we want people to stay home hiding away, basically until the bruise is healed and then they can go back to work. But obviously once I clicked on it and got familiar with all the details, I realized it's actually a really good thing, allowing people to find a new house, getting away from the abusive partner or the abusive situation.
Those things take time,
It does.
A certain amount of leave.
And I think New Zealand being one of the highest domestic violence state in the developed world, I found it actually really shocking to see that. So I think they've done really well, 10 days, paid leave. And we can only hope that more countries are following suit.
Yes. Hopefully Australia won't be far behind in bringing in something similar. That'd be great.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's a wrap for us for today.
Good chat, Jackie.
Yes, thanks, Maddie.
Finally, Anne and Tom from our cyber team looking at the latest news in the cyber world.
Tom, the Chinese tech company Huawei's bid for Australia's 5G network's been headlining the cyber news recently. What's the latest nationally and internationally in that?
Well, the last thing I heard is that Robert Hannigan, I think, who was head of GCHQ, and another ex-SIS, Secret Intelligence Service guy, Nigel Inkster, were asked about their opinions. And they basically broke it down into, if you have Huawei, you get access to really good technology, but you have to deal with the problem of having Huawei. And if you don't have Huawei, then you don't have that technology and you fall behind. So they framed it as a choice between being involved and running a risk, or not being involved at all and running a different kind of risk. So there's nothing really wrong with that framing of that argument. I just think that it's a good time to draw a line in the sand and say to Chinese lawmakers who have an intelligence law that obligates Huawei to assist, and Huawei personnel, that's not the kind of law we want in a world with global supply chains.
On laws, I suppose another cyber news story has been the MyHealth record, and the sort of backlash from the community about that. And today we've learnt that the government has backed down on some of the provisions that they had for MyHealth record. I'm interested in that as well. I think under legislation, currently, agencies such as police can have access to that information, and people are being asked to opt out rather than, they'll have a record created regardless. And so the government's now decided that they will change the legislation. They haven't told us when that will occur, so people still are a little bit unsure about whether they should opt out. But other issues are around things like how long they keep the data for, who has access to that data.
So I'm an inveterate optimist. So some years ago, I actually got a MyHealth record, and now I'm starting to regret it. So I was at a cybersecurity conference the other day, and not a single person I talked to is keen to, they're all going to opt out. And I'm thinking I should too now. So one of the things I've come across is that there's a really large list of software that has access to MyHealth records, and I'm not convinced that any of them have gone through any security testing whatsoever. And you were telling me about personal injury lawyers?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the issue for that sort of stuff is that anyone can legally have access to some of this information already. So how are we assured? The public hasn't been told really any information about what's being done with their information. There's been no communication strategies around that. And I do think that the other area of whether it's secure or not is the thing that's got me concerned, and which I think is in a lot of the news. And that's about how secure is government information. And we already know that the Australian National Audit Office, has already done a number of audits, and they've already said that compliance for cyber and for information security is reasonably low across that sector. So I think there are a whole heap of things wrong with the MyHealth record, and no wonder it's in the cyber news.
Yeah, I think it's all bad news. So tell me about Facebook.
Well, apparently Facebook have discovered through their own investigation that, there's been an influence campaign started back up again, and that they've taken down 32 pages. Possibly the Russians, but they haven't sort of indicated who it is. But it's very similar to what occurred during the national election in 2016.
So do you think Facebook's just trying to get ahead of this issue to avoid any sort of possible regulation?
I think they're trying to do whatever they can to appease whoever they can, but also so that they don't have as many controls put on them. So it is like any business. If you can self-regulate and do it yourself rather than be told to do it or be required to do it via law or government, then that's always a better strategy. And I think that's where Facebook is heading. But it is a concern, I think, to Australia, in that we need to think about how vulnerable we are to that sort of influencing campaign. We haven't seen anything like it here, but it's only a matter of time. We're a democratic country like the US. We are an ally of the US, so we might be a target for that sort of campaign. What's your view on that?
So I think Australia would be stupid to think that we're immune. We have this sense that we're in a little backwater that no one ever cares about, but I think that's just not true. Adversaries can be very opportunistic and just seize options and places where they can get an advantage. I did see that in the States, Senator Mark Warner has released a paper suggesting about 14, 15 different policy initiatives that could be made that range from requiring bots to be identified to all sorts of other things. So that paper is on my to-read list. I haven't got there yet, but...
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks for listening to Policy, Guns and Money. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time.